Hello, everyone. My name is Reese Garlinski, and this is Where You Want to Be, where I use my education about history and the world and take you with me to help you find your place within it. This world we live in is beautiful, and there's so much to explore, and I've been lucky enough to do a lot of that in my life, and I see a lot more of that happening in the future. So I want to take you around the world with me to meet people and see sights and learn about things that I've been lucky enough to learn about firsthand. Today, we are talking about Hamburg, Germany, one of the most populated and important cities in Germany for many reasons, which we'll get into in a little bit later, and one that comes with many different ups, downs, facts, and changes recently. So I want to open with some cool facts and tell you guys some things about the city. So first fact that I always open with is the etymology of the name Hamburg. So Hamburg comes from the 8th century. It was actually named after a castle fortress that was built by Emperor Charlemagne, who was the leader of the Franks and kind of birthed Europe in its modern sense with the Holy Roman Empire and all its descendants that ended up becoming nations of today. So Charlemagne builds this castle to defend this region of Hamburg, which is becoming a port city even early in history, back in the 8th century CE, and helps defend this kind of crux where the Elbe and the Ulster rivers meet, because this place was becoming very popular for trade and very much supported him and his system. So the name Hammerburg, or Castle Hammerburg, ended up being the namesake for the city, which meant castle on the bay or castle in the meadows. So that perfectly represents what this castle was at the time. Another fact for you guys is that Hamburg is sometimes referred to as the Venice of the North. That is because of all the canals within the city that need to have a bridge going over it to connect point A to point B. Because of that, there are over 2,500 different bridges in Hamburg, making it seem a lot like Venice. And also, this is like 4 or 5 times more bridges than there are in Venice, and that makes it so that Hamburg is the city with the most bridges in the entire world. Another thing that's super important about the city, and will definitely shock most people, is that the Beatles actually have a huge connection of their history to Hamburg. So Hamburg is in Germany, and obviously the Beatles are from England. They're very British. But because of the fact that it was so cheap for this young, up-and-coming band of guys who did not have a lot of money, it was super cheap for them to get to Hamburg from London. At this time, when they were coming up in history, in the mid to late 1900s, it was very cheap to get from London to Hamburg, at least according to the Beatles. And because of that, a bunch of dozens and dozens of their first shows were actually in Hamburg. And they found their sound in Hamburg by playing different songs for the Hamburg Germans that were here and the different Europeans that were visiting the city, and hearing the way that they reacted to the music and changed and really found the culture of the Beatles and the musicians that they were in Hamburg before they became global megastars like they did. And finally, the fact I want to end with is about Miniature Wonderland. This is the largest miniature model replica railway in the world. It has the largest model railroad in the world, and it has thousands of figurines that make up a miniature world, and it is widely considered the best in its class out of the entire world. And because of this, I actually didn't get to see it, how popular it is. When I came to Hamburg, this was also the start of my journey in Europe, where I was super inexperienced trying to figure out how to be a backpacker, and it didn't work out in this case. Hamburg was a rough one for me trying to figure out. We'll get into more of that later. But I did miss this. I missed out on actually seeing Miniature Wonderland, despite the fact that it is one of the most popular sites in Hamburg, because it was booked out days and days and days, and if I were to go, it would have costed me way more than my budget was allowing me to spend on going to see some figurines. So I missed it. So don't be like me, and definitely look into changing that for if you're ever going to end up going here. Make sure you book that in advance. So with that, those are all the facts I have for you guys, and that's our start with Hamburg. Next thing I'm going to do is give you guys an overview, a very, very big overview of the history of Hamburg, so you guys can kind of understand some of the other things we'll talk about as we get through this episode, which will be different tourist sites, their history, major sites in the city, their history, and some things I recommend to do, and get you through visiting Hamburg. So thank you guys so much for this part, and let's get right into this history. The first people in this area were Germanic tribes that didn't put anything really permanently down until around 825 CE. That's when this castle of Hammerburg is built. It was a moated castle to protect the area. It's built in 825 CE by Charlemagne and his people and becomes very important. This region ends up becoming a really major religious center, so there's missions launched from Hammerburg Castle out into the north to, in their terms, civilize the pagan barbaric Vikings that were living in the north and bring them Christianity. Then in the 1100s, the commercial part of Hamburg's history, which is the most important part of Hamburg's history, is when it becomes this commercial city using its ports. That happens in the 1100s because the Baltic cities, think Estonia, or the Baltic nations, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, their major cities like Tallinn and all those really start to take off as trade cities as well. And because of the fact that Hamburg had easy access to the Baltic Sea through the river it was on, like the Ulster and all that, shooting right up into the Baltic, they were able to trade with them relatively easily. Now, because of the fact that this German city, or Germanic city, starts to really trade heavily with the north and become very successful at that, it actually joins into the Hanse, which is this association of German cities, northern German cities, with the Hanseatic League. And the Hanseatic League was a major, major player in the 1200s, which united a bunch of Christian German cities into one both knight and trade network. So there were the Hanseatic League of Knights that wanted to spread Christianity through the sword, and there was also the Hanseatic Trade League, which used those knights to protect trade interests in the name of Christianity so that these northern cities could make money. So half of it is money making through trade, other half of it is literal holy knights that are spreading the word of Christianity through sword, as was very common practice during this time. And the Hanseatic League had major clashes with the Scandinavian nations and cities, Denmark, Copenhagen, Norway, Oslo, all those cities that were or in their early stages forming, those nations, and the Viking history was clashing heavily with those. So we'll see some greater clashes develop very soon. In 1231, full incorporation into the Hanseatic League begins, and this makes the trade empire of Hamburg grow even more. This nation now becomes known for its beer and its different resources that are traded across the Baltic and to many different areas where their rivers connect to, under the protection of the Hanseatic League. Then we jump to the 1500s, where after an extremely dominant prime in trade and spreading of the Christian faith and invading other nations, liberating them, as they say, all those things, the Hanseatic League actually starts to fall. It's dwindling away. Its powers roughly dried up by the mid-1500s, and in 1550, Hamburg cuts its last ties officially from the Hanseatic League. Then, from the mid-1500s all the way to the end of the 1600s, there's a lot of investments made by Hamburg into their own city. They open their own stock exchange, they open the Bank of Hamburg, and they start to heavily fortify the city to defend itself against all the different nations around them, because Europe is starting to break into many wars throughout the 1600s. Think the 30 Years' War, which swept up so many different nations. Because of that, Hamburg wanted to defend itself. All that happens, and the big change actually happens in 1770. Perhaps the most important in Hamburg's history up to this point is they officially cut ties with Denmark. These ties with Denmark were related to trade, taxes, tariffs, and protection, all kind of stemming from that Hanseatic period. There was always some kind of connection between Hamburg and Denmark, despite it being a part of the Hanseatic League, which was opposed by the Kalmar Union, which was kind of like the northern equivalent, the Scandinavian equivalent, where I'm not going to give you the whole history of Denmark right now, but they form a trade union called the Kalmar Union to defend against the Hanseatic League. But while those things are happening, there's kind of a Romeo and Juliet story between Denmark and Hamburg where they have connection. In 1770, Hamburg finally cuts that connection off fully, and Denmark, because of that, recognizes Hamburg as a city that is an imperial German city, meaning that it has no obligation to anyone except for the Holy Roman Emperor, who is the head of the Holy Roman Empire, which is the huge governing body of Central Western Europe at this time. So Denmark pretty much said, as long as you still care what the emperor thinks, you're good to go. When the 1800s roll in, so did a lot of change. In 1810, Napoleon invaded the city of Hamburg, which had mostly avoided war, and annexed it. For 5 years, there was a lot of back and forth, but Napoleon is finally defeated in 1815 at the Battle of Waterloo, and the Congress of Vienna changes Europe to redraw it in wake of Napoleon's time. During this time, the German Confederation is formed, and Hamburg joins it, but joins the German Confederation with a special distinction, as the free and Hanseatic city of Hamburg, meaning it had more freedoms and autonomy under the German Confederation than many other cities did. Then time rolls on to the 1870s, when actual unification happens, and Hamburg becomes one of the biggest cities in Germany once it unifies in 1870. Then in the 1880s, Germany, as a strong nation, helps support Hamburg in this decision, which is when Hamburg opens up its ports and builds the largest continuous shipping warehouse complex in the world. And that title is still true to this day because it is huge. And then in the 1890s, it's actually a person from Hamburg who invents cruise lining. And that culture mixes with the shipping culture to make this port city super huge for visiting. And today, 400,000 people a year come to visit Hamburg via cruise or launch on a cruise from Hamburg. Those mixed numbers of cruise affecting Hamburg equal almost 500,000 people. Just think of the ones that you think of anytime you think of a giant freight ship or anything of that sort. They're used by Hamburg very heavily at this time, and it completely changes the shipping culture. Hundreds of millions of tons are now shipped in and out of Hamburg because of that. And then that carries on all the way to 2002 when the biggest container terminal was opened called Alvera, and it just completely changed Hamburg even more. Now the city's exporting 145 million tons of different goods in and out of the city, exporting out of the city and bringing in different goods. And at the same time, Hamburg also becomes the largest rail port hub in all of Europe, meaning that all different kinds of rail trade comes into here, shoots out of here. It's the biggest one in Europe still to this day. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Hamburg was actually able to connect heavily with Eastern markets and the Eastern European market through trade, which was previously blocked off by the Soviet Union. Of course, Hamburg is in northwestern Germany, so it was always on the capitalist, more free side than the Soviet-controlled side. And so once this trade opened up, the city blew up even more economically and became even more successful. And then since then, the start of the 90s, 2000s, that range, modernizing the city has been the go-to. There's huge art projects, huge public works. One of the most famous sites is this giant opera house that also operates as a museum and so many more things in Hamburg. All these things to draw people into the city and not just use it for trade. Tourism has become a major part of the Hamburg economy alongside the giant shipping trading system that has been a part of the city for centuries. So that's where we are in the present today. And Hamburg is one of the most important cities in Germany. I believe right now it is the second biggest by population. And it is just massive and important. And so much goes on in Hamburg. And so many Germans I talked to while traveling were like super high on Hamburg because of the fact that they feel the city is so important to their nation's history, even though it's represented itself independently in so many different ways. So that's all I have for you on the history. If you are interested in learning more about the history of both Hamburg and Germany, I did a very much deeper coverage of the history with different statistics, architecture, all that on my podcast. And I did the same thing for the greater history of Germany as a nation. That is on my podcast that started this whole thing called Young History. The description down below will have links to that. So if you want to learn more, I encourage you to check that out as one of my favorite ways to learn about history. And now that we've gone through a survey of the history of Hamburg, allow me to give you the history and importance of some of the major sites within the city. The first one is Elbphilharmonie. It is a concert venue and museum and food venue on top of a 1960s warehouse that has 3 concert venues, a hotel, and more. It also has a viewing deck for one of the best views in the city. It's a beautiful site from the outside with a top that looks like waves or sails based on who you ask, both representing the ocean mercantile history of Hamburg, the waves being what they traveled on and sails being how they traveled. On top of this, the most beautiful part of this entire building is what happens inside for both musical and artistic feats that happen in this building every single day. The next one is St. Michael's Church. It is one of the most famous sites in the city and is by far the most well-known church. It is one of 5 main Lutheran churches in the city, and touring it is one of the most common things to do in Hamburg. Built throughout many different centuries, both the 17th, 18th, and 20th centuries were all times where this was built and expanded upon in the Baroque style. Another historical site and tourist spot would be Chocoversum. It's a chocolate museum that sits in the Altstadt of Hamburg. It opened in 2011 as a free-flowing history of the cocoa bean. Then in 2016, it revamped into a guided experience with more tasting and chocolate in the modern world. It also talks about the issues around the world with chocolate costs, where most of the money from chocolate production is for nations like Germany, Switzerland, France, who produce the actual chocolate bar, versus the nations that do the hardest labor, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, and nations like that, where they're actually harvesting the coffee bean after they grow it on their land. So now there's this new promise, kind of a fair trade market, where the value of a chocolate bar sold is more evenly divided among the countries and businesses that went into making the whole thing, rather than just the people who put their packaging on the final completed product. Today, in this museum, there is a 90-minute guided tour that takes one through the entire chocolate-making process and a history of the bean itself. And now that we've bounced through some historical sites and what they mean, I'm going to give you guys my tips for Hamburg. The first is St. Nikolai Church. It is a Baroque-style church with the most famous view of the city, with a lift to the top of the church. Right next to it is a history exhibit that commemorates the Warsaw Uprising in Poland. From what I've read, this may be a rotating exhibit, but when I was there, it was about the Warsaw Uprising in Poland because it was the 80-year anniversary of that happening the summer I was here in Hamburg. But I bet it's one that kind of rotates through different history points. It costs less than 15 euros to go up into this church and enter the exhibit. So I say you should go do that. It's a great view of the city. It's a fun little thing to break up your walking and breaking up different things you're doing. As a quick little toss of money at it, go up, see the city, take your pictures, and go right back down. You also get a little pamphlet for history of the building and different stuff about Hamburg as well. Very well worth it. The next one would be Miniature Wonderland. If you're considering going to Miniature Wonderland, definitely book it in advance and make it one of the things you plan to do in Hamburg because it's popular enough that you need to plan around it. Also, if you are someone who is obsessed with model figurines and landscapes, this is an absolute must. It is widely considered the finest miniature figurine spacing and set in the entire world, and it's one that you definitely need to check out. So I didn't actually get to go check this out, except for this quick little pass that I got with a friend because he happened to work there, but I did not book in advance. However, it is one that most people do in Hamburg, and I think you should too. And now I'm going to give you a recommendation I actually got from two Germans I actually met on my way to Hamburg in Dortmund, and we'll get into that later. So shout out to my friends Danny and Fritz. So these guys told me that you need to go to cheap bars, and that's the thing that normal Hamburgers do. People who live in Hamburg are not going to the chocolate museum. They're not going to XYZ because they're not tourists. But the thing they do is go west of downtown and end up in the very culturally German area and go bar to bar and drink with their friends and commune in that way. My favorite were the day bars I went to just west of the Old Town, which were super accessible by public transport. There was Zum Goldenen Handschutz, the Ritzen, and the final one, Elbschachschloller. I'll make sure I spell all those out here because my German pronunciation was probably considered a crime. And again, these are recommended by two friends I met in Germany, Danny and Fritz, who paid for a few rounds of beers in that city. So shout out to you two, and that's definitely what I recommend you do in that city is go over to Hamburg, get some drinks with some Germans, and go to places that are just like this, very German ran, not recognizable by tourists. Go there, get some cheap beer, have a good time. The must-eat food of Hamburg is this. It's the Fischbrötchen. The history of fish consumption in Hamburg is because of its proximity to the North and Baltic Seas. This dish is, as it sounds, a fish sandwich made most conventionally with herring. It'll be good anywhere you get it outside of the tourist areas, but the best one I had was just outside of the Hamburg Hauptbahnhof station in a Turkish place, and it was perfect. I'll throw up a picture and see if you guys can nail it down. I cannot remember the name for the life of me, but this sandwich is really good. There's a bunch of different ways to get it. I popped in this little Turkish place, had them do it their style, and I got it to go from somewhere else on the way out. But you could also go really bougie and go to a place that takes their sandwich very seriously, gets you a very, very high quality, expensive cut of fish, and puts it on their sandwich. But however you want to do it that way. But I do recommend the Turkish place just outside of Hauptbahnhof station. And my final tip with Hamburg here is about travel. So because Hamburg is in kind of the northern part of Germany, it's in North Germany, the only way to get there using major railways via train that's what most backpackers will do. They'll get the Eurail pass. For me, I was in Brussels trying to get to Hamburg. The only way to get to those cities, because of the fact that it's next to such major cities, is to connect either through Cologne in the west or Berlin in the east. So if you were like me and coming from Brussels, you absolutely need to book that in advance and reserve that spot. A lot of people don't know this. Even if you get the Eurail pass, you still have to pay a lot throughout your trip to reserve seats on certain routes. You can get from a little town in wherever Germany to another town in wherever Germany for free. But if you're trying to get from Brussels to Paris, Brussels to Cologne, Brussels to Berlin, there's going to be fees associated with reserving a seat on that train, even if you already have the ticket on a technicality. So book that in advance, because for me, it was the worst day of travel I had in Europe, and backpacking was trying to get from Brussels to Hamburg. I was in the middle of the night still marching through Dortmund and all these other Dusseldorf. I saw Cologne at like 7 p.m. I did all this and didn't even get to Hamburg until the sun was rising the next day, and my hostel had already expired. So it was just entirely too much. So don't be like me. Don't waste your time fumbling all this. Book a ticket early and avoid a treacherous climb from any other country in the West or major city to get to Hamburg, because you have to get to Hamburg some way. And if you're doing it by train, book that thing early. And after all that history, knowledge I've taken you through of the city, and my different tips and tricks for what to do when you're in Hamburg, that brings us to the end. This city has maintained its culture of this strong mercantile city that has traded all over Europe and the world for centuries. It's maintained that culture and maintained its own representation throughout many eras of European history, throughout many eras of world history, and Hamburg is still a very unique city today. When you go there, it doesn't feel like a lot of other cities in Germany. It does have its very own clear cutout culture. That's the thing I love to see from a city. I love when it knows what it's about. It's not just an everything city. It's a we do this. In Hamburg, they eat Fischbrötchen. In Hamburg, they do shipping. In Hamburg, there's arts. In Hamburg, there's a million bridges. All those things and the other things I told you guys to go do there, like the bars, are what make Hamburg the city it is. They're what has made it known for its culture and why Germans feel the way they do about it, and why so many people around the world go past through Hamburg as part of a longer journey or as part of their reason for seeing the city itself. So all that is going to be the end for me. I'm very, very glad you guys tapped in today. Hope you guys learned something cool. And, of course, if you're more interested in learning more, I covered the full history of Hamburg in the podcast down below. And I've covered the greater history of the country of Germany, which represents Hamburg and so many other different kind of people groups. I also covered that in the same podcast, Young History, and that'll also be down below. So if you guys got a lot of value out of this and you want to learn more, that's there for you. But even more importantly, I'm glad you saw even this today. No matter how much you watched, how much you got out of it, I hope it was something, and I hope it was something that makes you come right back. So definitely like this. If you liked it, throw a comment down there to tell me what you thought. And with that, I'm going to sign off. So thank you guys so much for being here, and I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful day.